Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Machado de Assis. But before we get into today's video, I have a brief announcement to make. I am shifting the way that you can support me and my channel to Buy Me a Coffee, which is a platform where you can quite literally buy me a coffee and send a tip my way once, twice, or however many times you feel like it. It should be more convenient for those of you who watch my videos and are enjoying my channel and just want to send a quick tip my way, as I have heard in comments on my lives before. Speaking of lives, I will be talking about this in my June 2022 live, so if you're watching this video at a later date, you can find the video for the June 2022 live where I talk about it in greater detail. I also speak in Portuguese and in English because I have no way of subtitling my lives, so if you've ever been curious to hear me talking in a spontaneous, real-time Portuguese, that is your best place to do so. So come hang out in the lives, hear some Portuguese, get your comments and questions answered, and so on. It's a fun time, and I will also be talking, like I said, a little bit more in detail about Buy Me a Coffee. And with that being said, let's get on to the video. So in today's video, we're going to be talking all about Machado de Assis, but you might be asking yourself why it is that we're focusing on Machado de Assis. And the reason for that is fairly simple. There's a sort of meme or discussion that goes around social media ever so often about what Machado de Assis might have sounded like. We don't have any recordings of Machado de Assis himself actually talking, as far as I'm aware, and so there is great speculation online as to what he might have sounded like. There are a number of reasons for this, and the biggest reason for this is that he was born and raised in Rio. He was a Carioca. The Carioca accent is one of the most distinctive accents in all of Portuguese. It is one of the most broadly recognizable accents in the Portuguese language. But to start with, we need to take a step back and talk a little bit about just who Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis actually was. Machado de Assis was born the son of freed slaves into a poor family in Rio in 1839. He lived until 1908 and therefore was alive throughout most of the 1800s. This was a very transformative time both for society in general, but also the Portuguese language specifically. The Portuguese language across dialects was undergoing many phonetic changes that would come to consolidate themselves in the late 1800s and early to mid 1900s. And this is part of the basis for the speculation of what Machado de Assis might have sounded like. Machado de Assis himself is considered Brazil's greatest author, or something of the godfather of Brazilian literature. His works are the prime example of classics in Brazilian literature, including titles that are read throughout the Portuguese-speaking world, such as Dom Casmurro, Quincas Borba, and Memórias Póstumas de Brás Cuba. And despite this status, Machado de Assis himself, given his background, was fairly undereducated in a formal setting. Most of his learning came from informal circumstances, but in a highly extraordinary way that did not stop him from becoming an extremely well-learned person. He was mostly self-taught and picked things up from teachers outside of schools, and he was even multilingual, having studied the great languages of learned circles at the time, namely French, English, German, and Greek. Along his process of becoming a more erudite and literary person, he worked in several governmental offices as well as at various newspapers. He began to gain a public profile through the publication of poetry and other writings in newspapers. So suffice it to say that Machado de Assis, given the social context of the 19th century at large, but especially in Brazil, is nothing short of an extraordinary figure in literary history. And the linguistic context of the 1800s is also very important. As I mentioned before, the Carioca accent is a highly distinctive accent in Portuguese. And one of the reasons for this is that the Carioca accent in Portuguese is one of the most phonetically innovative accents in all of Portuguese. The Carioca accent in Portuguese spawned a number of sound changes, some of which actually spread to the rest of Brazil. It is famed for being sort of sing-songy or highly melodic in its intonation, as well as having specific sounds to it that set it apart from other accents. And there is also social and political history that is tied to the accent, given the status of Rio as a major city in Brazil. Rio, of course, was the capital of colonial Brazil for a long time, but it was also the capital of Portugal as an empire as a whole during a tumultuous period in the early 1800s. So for about 13 years, from 1808 to 1821, the Portuguese royal court established itself in Rio, which led to a great transformation of Rio in the form of many public works, as well as the influx of a large number of the Portuguese aristocracy. Machado de Assis himself was actually born 18 years after the Portuguese royal court left the city, and we will get into why that's important in a little bit. But from that point on, Rio's status as the most important city in Brazil was cemented. It would go on to become the capital of the newly independent Brazil, which happened shortly after the Portuguese royal court had finished leaving the city in 1822. Rio remained the capital of Brazil after its independence until the city of Brasilia was built in the mid-1900s, and so naturally speaking, with that political and cultural importance, the city of Rio grew quite quickly. When there is such a large populational shift in any given place, this will naturally have an effect on the accent of that place, and Rio is no exception. Not only from other regions of Brazil, we can't forget the mass influx of European immigrants in the late 1800s. So the question that's posed on social media goes something along the lines of, would Machado de Assis have sounded like contemporary Cariocas? This might be in reference to figures of more prestigious elements of cultural society, such as Chico Buarque or Fernando Montenegro, but it can also be in reference to figures of pop culture, such as Ronaldo or Anitta. The question being asked is, would Machado de Assis have sounded like these Cariocas with their distinctive ways of speaking? And in order to deduce that, we have to lay out some of the defining features of Carioca speech. Carioca speech is known for many different things. As I mentioned before, it has a very recognizable prosody, or the rhythm and intonation of how it sounds, but it is also highly innovative with regards to sounds. The Carioca accent developed a high degree of palatalization. The process of palatalization is the process by which sounds come to be made in the hard upper frontal part of your mouth. You'll notice that there's a little ridge there, and palatalization draws those sounds up further to that position. This has led to the distinctive chi and g sounds in Brazilian Portuguese, which are largely considered to have consolidated in Rio and spread out from there to the rest of the country. But this also has an impact on other sounds, including the glide, which is the insertion of a diphthong where we wouldn't otherwise expect one. In the case of the Carioca accent and many other accents in Brazil more generally nowadays, this is generally the inclusion of an E sound where we wouldn't expect it, leading words like paj, maj, and luz to sound like pais, mais, and luis. And one of the big ones is the S shadow, or the pronunciation of the S as a sh sound in certain contexts, namely at the end of words or before other consonants. I previously mentioned that the Portuguese royal court spent 13 years in Brazil, and this is a very important thing in the context of the S shadow. The presence of the S shadow in Rio in particular is widely attributed to the presence of the Portuguese royal court in that city. This is largely down to some fairly circuitous references in linguistic literature from the mid-1900s. Certain studies postulated that the presence of the Portuguese court and the imitation of the prestige dialects from the Portuguese nobility would cause the native residents of Rio to imitate those accents and develop the S shadow in their speech. However, there is a doubt cast on this by more recent research, which takes a look into the documented dialectology of the Portuguese language from that period on. And this research shows a lack of any demonstrable historic documentation of this feature in the Carioca accent from that time period, whether that be in studies or observations on the Portuguese language as it is spoken, or in popular representations of how the language is spoken in things like plays. Ultimately, we are left to speculate, but it is far from certain that the Portuguese royal court is the origin of the S shadow in Rio. And I also find it to be less plausible given the generalized heavy palatalization of the Carioca accent consolidated in the late 1800s and early 1900s. If you'd like to learn more about palatalization and the development of the pronunciation of Brazilian Portuguese, I have a video dedicated just to that. I also have videos about the S shadow in Portuguese and the glide, so if you're interested, I definitely recommend that you check those out. But there are a couple of other sounds that I'd like to focus on as well that were shifting in the 1800s. The first of which is the sound of L at the end of words. In modern day Brazil, the L is heavily vocalized, which means that it sounds like a W sound or a vowel sound. The vocalized W sound of L in Brazil is in stark contrast to the heavily velarized L sound in European Portuguese. However, both of those sounds underwent the same process of modification, going further and further back in the mouth. In Brazilian Portuguese, however, it simply happened to go a step further and fully vocalized. This has also happened in Polish with the dark L. And we know that the vocalized L consolidated itself much earlier in Brazilian Portuguese, and by the early 1900s, 1800s was already widespread. The last sound I'd like to focus on, however, is the R, and I also have a video on both the vocalized L and R in Portuguese, so if you'd like a more in-depth explanation of those as well, I definitely recommend those videos. Now, R is a tricky sound in Portuguese because it has different realizations depending on which part of the word it comes in, and those different realizations vary from region to region, and the Carioca R is no exception. And the 1800s in both Portugal and Brazil, albeit separately, were the transition period away from the traditional rolled R as the hard R at the beginning of words in Portuguese toward a more guttural or back-of-the-throat type of a sound. The Carioca R is a little bit innovative. In this sense, it takes the traditional tapped or soft R before other consonants and also uses that back-of-the-throat sound. So instead of the R sound in a word like português, like Europeans pronounce it, they would have a H sound like português. At the same time, the pronunciation of R at the end of words can be either that back of the throat sort of a sound or eliminated altogether. So instead of falar, you might have falar, or you might have falar. And these are all natural sound shifts that independently arose in Brazilian dialects. So now that we have a general idea of some of the distinctive features of the Carioca accent, how might Machado de Assis have actually talked? First, we have to think about when Machado de Assis was born and grew up. Machado de Assis was born in 1839, or the early mid-1800s. This means that Machado de Assis was probably born into and witnessed in his lifetime a great shift in different generations' speech. His parents and grandparents' generations probably spoke somewhat differently to the way that he did, and the way that he spoke was actually probably fairly different to those of younger generations after him. We also know that people's accents, once they get past their adolescence, tend to not change all that much. In your adult years, you can have influences from other accents in your native language, but the accent that you come out of your adolescence with in your native language will tend to be the same accent that you carry with you for the rest of your life. So Machado de Assis probably spoke in a fairly different way to the common Carioca accent of today. The sound shift of the unstressed E vowel sounding like an E sound had already been consolidated in all dialects of Portuguese for a very long time. Brazilian Portuguese at large, and indeed also the Carioca accent, did not take that the step further that European Portuguese did, which shifted to the sound, leading to a pronunciation of a word like gente instead of gente. And European Portuguese took other vowel reduction further than Brazilian Portuguese in general, and also Carioca speech did as well. So Machado de Assis probably spoke with a fairly recognizably Brazilian pattern of vowel reduction. With regards to palatalization and all of the different ways that palatalization affected the Carioca accent to such an extent that it did, it's fairly unlikely that Machado de Assis, given where he was born and the context in which he was born, and later on as a deliberate, erudite individual in the way that he was using his language, would have spoken with those palatalized features, which means that Machado de Assis was probably not speaking with the chi and g sounds, and it is relatively dubious that he would have been speaking with the shadu as well. It's much more likely that he was speaking with a t and d sound and pronouncing the s at the end of words as a s sound. The glide, being a significantly more recent linguistic phenomenon, would almost certainly not have been a feature of his speech. It is highly unlikely that he would have gotten mas and mais confused, or said pais or luz instead of page and luge. But the R that he spoke with would likely be in transition, with many people in the region starting to take on features that would come to be recognized as that back-of-the-throat sound of the hard R in Carioca speech. It is also possible that this progression of the R would have already started to affect the realization of R at the ends of words, whether through elimination or the modification of the sound. In this instance, though, we know that Machado de Assis was an erudite and very deliberate individual with the way that he used his language. So the previous standard of the rolled or trilled R, or the R sound, would very likely have featured in his Portuguese for the simple fact that it was far from dead at this point in Brazil or in Portugal, and would have been seen as the more prestigious pronunciation of the R at that time. Similarly, because the L at that time was also in a period of transition, it's possible that he spoke with a highly velarized l sound, if not a vocalized w sound altogether. So he might have used an L at the end of words like Brazil or natural, but it's also plausible that he and other speakers in the region would have started to occasionally say the L as a w sound, so Brasil or natural. Ultimately, if we analyze the state of Portuguese phonetics in the mid-1800s, we can come to the conclusion that his accent probably sounded closer to news broadcasts that were recorded at the turn of the century than the modern modern-day Carioca accent that we know and recognize. There are a handful of examples of radio and video broadcasts from the very, very early 1900s available to listen to on YouTube. In those, you'll notice a deliberate and somewhat exaggerated rolled R for hard R, but you'll also notice the tap R at the end of words and before other consonants. It's likely that Machado de Assis's rolled R would have been a little bit softer if indeed he had the rolled R. As I said at the beginning of the video, this is all highly speculative because of the lack of recordings of Machado de Assis himself talking. However, we can make some educated guesses with a little bit of knowledge of linguistics overall. So I hope you enjoyed that look into the accent that Machado de Assis potentially spoke with. If you have anything to add to this conversation that I might not have gone to, or perhaps a different linguistically informed perspective on it, or even just further questions in general about it, don't hesitate to leave me a comment down below. I find this kind of historic dialectology to be super interesting, so if you'd like me to make more videos about this, I certainly will look into it. So that's all I've got for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you're not already. I have a ton of videos about Portuguese linguistics and other cultural topics on my channel to choose from and watch. You can find those directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.